Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Joining us for the second half of our show is Trevor Burrus, Research Fellow at the Cato Institute's Center for Constitutional Studies. Trevor, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Trevor, we're here at the finish line of the most expensive presidential election in American history, and also one where the profession of journalism has fallen to an all-time low in public esteem. I asked you on to talk about two perennial hot-button issues that you study and write about: campaign finance reform and defunding public broadcasting. Let's start with the first. Take us back. Take us back to the beginning of presidential campaigns and describe the arc of how elections were financed and how, when, and why the federal government started regulating the process.
Campaigns were very, very different, of course, in the founding era when we're talking about Adams and Jefferson and George Washington. At that time, spending money on yourself to run for election was considered to be very gauche. So candidates, they stood for election, which kind of was literally meant to be a passive thing, that you stood up there and you didn't do anything to campaign for yourself. Other people campaigned for you. But they did do a fair amount of buying people beer and parties and having different events to kind of get your name out there. That's pretty much a lot of how campaigning works. There's a lot of variations, but I'm going to skip over just the 19th century. We have populism with Andrew Jackson, and I'm going to skip over the 19th century and get into the early part of the 20th century, which is when we start having some discussions about money in politics, particularly surrounding the progressive era and people like Teddy Roosevelt, who have a problem with big business. And there were some investigations concerning how different businesses and corporations were funding elections. And in 1907, there was an act called the Tillman Act, which prohibited corporations from giving money directly to candidates in federal campaigns. Now, I'm going to skip forward again because everything kind of starts in the modern era in 1974 when they passed the Federal Election Campaign Act, which was passed because of all the fervor for clean government after Watergate. The Federal Election Campaign Act was like nothing that had ever been seen before. It was so extreme that they passed it with the sure knowledge that there would be an immediate First Amendment challenge to the law. And the law was written in such a way to allow the court to carve it up, what are called severability clause, should they strike down some part of the law as being against the First Amendment. And that creates our basic system we have today. And the most important thing that listeners need to understand, journalists make this mistake all the time. Basically, we have contributions, which are things that you can give to candidates or things that you can give to super PACs and things like this. But contributions to candidates are regulated and limited for individuals. So you can give $2,700 to a candidate for the general and the primary. The other types of spending is what we call expenditures. And this is a very important distinction. Expenditure is when you spend independently in support of a candidate. So if you decide to buy a speaker truck and drive it up and down the streets yelling, vote for Hillary Clinton, and you spent your money on the speaker truck and you didn't associate with the Clinton campaign at all, then that would be an independent expenditure. And a lot of the debate nowadays with super PACs, with Citizens United, revolves around what are called independent expenditures for people doing pure free speech in the most pure way, trying to get a candidate elected by spending their own money to advocate for that candidate.
Well, people worry about money buying elections. Graft is certainly as old as politics, and there are plenty of examples from Teapot Tome to Tammany Hall to that congressman who was caught with $100,000 in his freezer. What examples do we have from history of individuals or groups who've successfully bought an election?
It's an interesting question. I think that there aren't many, but it depends on what you mean by that. If you go back to machine politics like Tammany Hall, you could say that those elections were purchased, quote unquote, via the patronage system that existed at the time. So the people who ran for office were getting votes from people by giving them jobs in government. And you could say that those were kind of bought elections. But it's very important to understand that what most people think about money in politics is incorrect, which is to say that you can't just buy an election. And of course, in 2012, we saw a massive amount of money get spent for many candidates who lost. We had Meg Whitman in California spend over $100 million of her own money to try and get elected and simply lose that election. There is a basic rule that you cannot just spend your money and yourself into office. Now, This doesn't mean that money doesn't matter, but people tend to popularly think that you can just buy yourself into office. Now, the question you had about graft is an interesting question that relates to the kind of relationship that politicians have to the people they represent. And I think that this is a more complex question than people want to think about, because part of it goes back to what the nature of representation is. It is a very widely held belief that Congress is bought off. And what that means when any individual person says that is something different. But I ask the question that if you are a member of the House who represents a district where aircraft parts, say Boeing, is 40% of the jobs in your district, what are you supposed to be doing as a representative of your district? Are you supposed to be securing Boeing tax breaks? Is that a valid use? And if Boeing gives you campaign donations and you secure them tax breaks, are you securing them tax breaks which help out your constituents because they gave you a campaign donation? Or is it more nuanced in this and you're simply being a good representative for your people, which could include some amount of graft? In some sense, politics is exchange. There's a trade-off in politics where you're supposed to bring the goodies back home to your district and they're going to vote for you. And in a lot of ways, we just tolerate that in the sense of all the tariffs and special carve-outs we have throughout the country. So we need to have a better idea of the realities of politics. Politics is dirty. It's transactional. It involves giving people things that they want in exchange for them voting for you. We think that politics can be cleaned up, and we think that laws like the Federal Election Campaign Act, and we think that overturning Citizens United would somehow turn politics into a very clean debate about the issues of the day, and we wouldn't have this graft anymore. I think that that's absolutely silly. The government is too big for the people to control, and it's so big, and it's so easy to give away favors because the people can't monitor it. That's the basic realities of our government, and we need to have a system to try and control that.
Let's dig a bit deeper into the business model of politics. Remind us how milker bills work.
It's a basic idea of constantly having bills on the table, the sort of big hot button issues. Gun control is a really good example of one, wherein you can always raise money on gun control. Think about the bills that you see on campaign ads. Think about the bills that are cited. They're abortion bills, they're gun control bills, and the ads always say that he voted against gun control or she voted for gun control, and therefore you need to stop this person. And ultimately, they'll bring some of these bills up just for the purpose of raising money off of them. This was part of what the Democrats did with the sit-in on gun control this summer, which was to bring up a bill they knew wasn't going to pass, but then they could make a bunch of ads off of to say that these people who I'm running against voted against gun control. So they're usually just used to just gin up political interest and people being irate about whatever side so they can start giving some money.
So trying to stop money from washing into Washington is a lot like trying to stop the tide from coming in. In what way can disclosure rules help alleviate fears? And in what ways can disclosure requirements be used to suppress free speech?
I am very skeptical, actually, that disclosure rules do help alleviate fears, because I think fundamentally the problems in D.C., if we know who's funding these things, it's not going to change the fact that there are constituents out there that sort of think that anything that ExxonMobil spends its money on, or the NRA spends its money on, or the SEIU spends its money on is suspect to begin with. And I do actually think that disclosure rules have a way of making our politics a little bit more dirty. You asked about how campaigns have been run throughout history. Well, one interesting thing about campaigns and political speech back in the founding era is that most of it, if not the norm, was to have it done anonymously. The Federalist Papers were written under Publius. No one really knew that it was Alexander Hamilton and James Madison and John Jay. The Anti-Federalist Papers were written under Cato and Brutus and Federal Farmer. And it was considered kind of gauche to expose yourself, because then all people would do would be attack the speaker and not the ideas. And we do a lot of that in politics now. But nevertheless, disclosure can be important for some sort of sunlight foundations to monitor what people are giving, for the government itself to monitor what people are giving. But I think we need to have a real meaningful conversation about what disclosure can actually do and who should have their information disclosed. The Supreme Court recently denied cert in a case that they probably would have taken if Justice Scalia was still alive, where in Delaware has passed a law that requires people to disclose their name and address if they gave $25 for 4 years to a 501c3 religious nonprofit. And the reason they have to do this, at least under the government's theory, the government of Delaware's theory, is because the 501c3 religious nonprofit published material that mentioned the names of candidates. And that's it. Now, this is just ludicrous. The problem with the disclosure is that we're not really tailoring it to the goals. If we were to get down to brass tacks and I was going to help draft new campaign finance regulations, I'd be willing to compromise to say that disclosure would be good for campaign contributions over $50,000, over $25,000. I don't see any good reason to have campaign contributions of $2,700 being disclosed. And most people don't realize that your neighbors can go onto the federal election websites and look at your political contributions. The question is does any voter ever use for a proxy the disclosure statements of who is giving away as a reason to vote? Is that ever the marginal reason that they decided to vote for or against someone? It has very little benefit to the Republic, and it has much harm to the speaker, especially the way it's now being used, because there are a lot of people out there who think that political spending is sort of per se wrong, and so they want this all disclosed, even $25, because they think that anyone who spends money in an election is probably trying to get something illicit or bad from it, whereas most people who put money into elections, it's just a normal consumption good. They like to support causes they believe in, and this is also why people give to Cato. It's a very precarious line, and right now the Supreme Court is rubber stamping disclosure rules, and therefore the people who hate political spending are using the most onerous disclosure requirements to shut down political speech.
Trevor, let's move on to the role the press plays in assuring free and fair elections. And journalism has hardly distinguished itself during this presidential campaign, has it?
No, it has not. And you could say it's a difficult question. We're in a transition period right now of trying to figure out how to move from an old style of journalism to a new style of journalism. And of course, the eyes on the screen are going down. The amount of people who are watching these news programs are going down. So there's a lot of sensationalism. And this is important for what our last segment was about for Donald Trump, because Donald Trump was the sensationalist candidate for this election. Under the New York Times calculation, he received $2 billion, essentially free coverage from the media, what it would have cost him $2 billion to spend on his own. And this is an important consideration when we talk about campaign finance restrictions, because if you're going to restrict the Koch brothers and Tom Steyer or anyone else, it's an open question of why does the mass media get to just choose a candidate and cover him extensively. And people might say, oh, yeah, but they were covering Donald Trump saying stupid things. But the most important thing you need in a presidential election or any election is just name recognition. And the fact that they put him on all the time made people think that he must be important and must be the front runner. And then, of course, he became the front runner. And this is a big concern. And I think that what happened with journalism right now is going to change the conversation about how journalists cover politics and about campaign finance too, because a lot of people are pretty upset with journalists.
What role does public broadcasting play in this? We're coming up next year on the 50th anniversary of the bills that provided taxpayer support for NPR and PBS. Where do they stand today?
Well, right now, public broadcasting lives in a pretty marginal, embattled state. It has sort of been that way since, I would say, the 80s. Public broadcasting started, if you remember, the three networks kind of situation that we had in the late 60s. And so LBJ had this idea that there could be great civic-minded, culturally enriching, government-funded programming, especially for rural areas, and also especially for children. There was a concern that the children were not getting good enough programming, so very soon after public broadcasting was founded, we had Sesame Street and the Children's Television Workshop was founded. So there was a lot of very big goals for public broadcasting. And immediately after it was founded, it ran into Richard Nixon, who hated public broadcasting because he thought they were challenging him too much. And of course, they covered the Watergate hearings extensively, which also he wasn't a very big fan of. And that sort of created the modern public broadcasting situation, which is why I advocate defunding public broadcasting. The left should want to defund public broadcasting because it's not all it could be, because conservatives constantly are threatening to defund it, and they don't need the money. There's a lot of ability to create nonprofit broadcasting entities, and I think this ties in very much with the campaign finance discussion and with our discussion of journalism today, because I think a lot of people on the left are going to start calling for increasing the funding of public broadcasting in order to combat the sort of journalistic malfeasance that we saw under Trump. And that's going to create a new issue about how public broadcasting covers campaigns because they're not unbiased. We're going to see this, I think, as the next big campaign finance discussion.
Let's back up a little bit because there seems to be a controversy about whether public broadcasting can make it on its own. What % of their budget is supported by taxpayers, and what happens to them if that money goes away?
Well, it depends on which one you're talking about, NPR or PBS. Trying to track the money that NPR and PBS gets is very difficult. NPR gets sort of direct funding, but that ends up being about 2 to 3% of their budget. They still have these drives where they look for funding and they get a lot of foundation grants. PBS is a little different because you do have funding going to local stations and local radio stations also who then purchase programming from PBS back. So I always describe it as a fountain that recycles itself. You know, when you have just a fountain that comes down and it brings the water back up to the top. PBS is more dependent upon government funding than NPR. NPR is a really good example, though, of kind of how it doesn't matter in the sense that 2 to 3%, they can easily survive without it. That's unquestioned. If they made a big to-do out of we're losing our government funding, I would give to them. I mean, I would totally, absolutely donate money to NPR to make them independent of the government, which hurts them, and they could be a nonprofit corporation that did the kind of news they do, which is very popular for a good reason. The problem here, and why my thesis of that they are affected by government money more than they think they are, is how hard they fight to keep that 2 to 3% of funding. Everyone says, oh, it's no part of their funding, but every single time someone comes along and rattles a little saber, a Republican says, hey, we're going to cut NPR's funding, they absolutely go bananas and go to the wall and to the hearings to try and protect that 2 to 3%. So that implies that they can be affected by this 2 to 3%.
Or maybe it's just another example of a milker bill that keeps coming around.
Yes, well, it is because NPR and PBS are things that people actually experience and enjoy. And so in that sense NPR is very popular, especially NPR, and they say, don't take my NPR. And of course, NPR can also gin up that support too. So yes, it is an example of a milker bill. It's never going to be defunded in any way. And of course, don't forget another factor of this too, which is that NPR and PBS, they like the funding, but they also like the imprimatur of the government. They like being the government's radio stations. And I think we're going to see a call for more imprimatur, that the government is making sure that the media is fair. And so we need to have more of that going forward, which will bleed into the campaign finance discussion.
In that line, do you think there'll be an attempt to distinguish professional licensed journalists from citizen journalists?
This is a great question because it's a good way. When I teach campaign finance, I often start with this because the very existence of campaign finance laws, which say that only some groups can spend independently and have to disclose whether or not they spend independently in support or against a candidate, or talking about politics in some way. The very existence of those laws means that there have to be media exemptions to those laws. The New York Times can support a candidate, can publicly endorse a candidate, and they don't have to comply with campaign finance laws. So this means that the government and the FEC has to decide who gets a media exemption. There's a lot of fights about whether or not local bloggers should get a media exemption or whether or not they have to register as a political committee. And of course, to me, the idea of the government kind of doing this licensing of journalists is insane and easily manipulatable by the kind of nefarious elements that use the IRS to target conservative groups. And you have had left-wing congressmen and congresswomen call for, say, rescinding Fox News' license because they think they're essentially a political committee. And this kind of stuff is very dangerous when you have that kind of political control over speech, supposedly in the name of the public good.
Let's swing back around to the Federal Election Commission. We had a former chair of the FEC on a few weeks ago, and his biggest fear was that the party in power, whichever it might be, would weaponize the FEC the way the IRS, the SEC, and the Justice Department have sometimes been turned into partisan political operations. Is there any risk of that happening?
The FEC, thankfully, is statutorily split. We do have 3 versus 3, and you can't have more than 3 of any one party on the commission. This, of course, means that the commission is right now, it sort of sits in a static situation because they can't agree on anything because they have fundamentally different views of what it means to regulate campaign spending. It could be possible, though, via a variety of backroom kind of pressures to weaponize the FEC. And weaponize the FEC is almost why it exists. The FEC is often brought into situations where it's a part of what we call lawfare, where a campaign tries to get the FEC involved because they don't like what their opponent is, what people are spinning about their opponent. So they've been weaponized in one way for a while, but it is possible that something could come along to push the FEC in a certain direction. But I think that right now we've seen it split for so long that it will generally stay that way. I think we need to worry more about the IRS and calls for the SEC to regulate campaign spending via publicly traded corporations, what people like Elizabeth Warren have been calling for. And there's no reason that the IRS, which they try to do under the 501c4 rule, or the SEC, which regulates securities, should be involved in campaign speech.
So political action committees or PACs are the big innovation of the prior decade. Are we going to see charitable foundations serving as political slush funds the major issue going forward?
I don't see that. There's pretty good divisions there for charitable funds. Depends if you mean by 501c3s.
I'm speaking specifically of the Clinton Foundation or the Trump Foundation. Are we going to see more of that going forward?
That's a good question. I think that the kind of behavior of these two candidates is a little bit exceptional in the sense of being exceptions to the kind of general nefariousness you expect from these foundations. I think that foundations have a pretty good incentive to keep track of their donors and what they're spending on, except for when they get involved with politics. But if they are that tied to a given family or presidential candidate, I think we should always be skeptical of where they're spending their money and whether or not they're spending their money with political aims behind it.
Well, we've seen an enormous amount of foreign money flow, particularly into the Clinton Foundation. Is that a concern?
Absolutely. But to me, I have the same sort of saying about this that people say about the Clintons. I mean, the Clintons are just the Clintons. They have a unique position in American politics for 3 decades. Everyone kind of regards them as crooked, even though they love Bill and tolerate Hillary. We all know that they're not on the up and up. It's sort of a known truth in American politics. So the Clinton Foundation is going to be uniquely suspect because it is the Clinton Foundation.
Trevor, after we get through this crazy election, do you think things will simmer down next year and we'll move on to other issues?
I'd like to think so, but I'm very skeptical. You started this off by talking about how this has been the most expensive presidential election. And every presidential election going forward will be the most expensive presidential election. People condemn this a lot, but I think the biggest reason this is occurring is because people think that there are higher stakes in the political game now. So they're much more prone to spend money to try and take control of the government. We pretty much now have every 2 years or 4 years a peaceful coup d'etat about who's going to run the government, who's going to run different parts of the government, whether Republicans or Democrats, and people spending a lot of money to make sure that either Republicans run it or Democrats run it because the country is so incredibly split about the issues that concern us on our daily lives. And so I think people are going to be spending more money on those issues because the country is not going to stop being split about this. And they're going to have more discussions about campaign spending. And watch for that, what I predicted about the public broadcasting and possibly more licensing of journalists as people try to overcome what they consider this Trump problem. If Trump does in fact lose, elites think that they were all misinformed by Fox News and Breitbart. So maybe what we need to do is stop that misinformation that caused Trump to happen. There's going to be a lot of sort of dangerous discussions about the need for more control over money in politics going forward, and I don't see it ending anytime soon.
Well, Trevor, that's a cheery thought for ending our conversation. I don't know about you, but I plan to spend Tuesday drinking heavily.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
That was Trevor Burrus, research fellow at the Cato Institute Center for Constitutional Studies, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. You can check out Real Clear Radio Hour on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And while you're at it, take a look at realclearfuture.com for daily updates on the next big wave of technologies. We'd like to thank our sponsor, Old Boston Restorations, for their support. Old Boston is a boutique property management company in Boston's South End. Visit them online at oldbostonrestorations.com. That wraps up our show for this week. Please join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.